without you further, I will go directly to introduce Professor Haggai Erlich, who is our first speaker. I have the pleasure and the honor to introduce our first speaker of our webinar tonight, Professor Haggai Erlich. He is whom I can call proudly a mentor in my interest of studying about Abai, or rather known as Nile also, and its people beyond the conflict, meaning the historical and cultural connection of people of the Nile. Professor Haggai Erlich is a professor emeritus at Tel Aviv University. Since 1973, for more than 3 decades, Professor Haggai taught and served as a head of graduate studies in the Middle Eastern History Department at Tel Aviv University. He did his BA in General History and History of the Middle East at Tel Aviv University, and he did his MA in History of Islamic People at Hebrew University, and he did his PhD in Ethiopian History at the School of Oriental Studies, or rather known as SOAS, in London. Professor Haggai has published 23 books and 61 articles, and usually his books or articles are about the Nile Valley. When it's not about the Nile Valley, it's people, it's about kings of Ethiopia, or it's about the Ethiopian politics, history, and socio-cultural, or it's about the Horn of Africa, the religion, politics, history, and culture of the region. When it's not that, then it's about Ethiopia's relation with the Middle East and the Horn. In general, his works, most of his works revolves around Ethiopia. His book, particularly for me, The Cross and the River, Ethiopia, Egypt, the Nile, and then the Nile History, Culture, Myths, and the one which is edited or written in his honor, narrating the Nile, politics, culture, and identities, are, in my belief, I think to many of us, gave a foundational knowledge of understanding about the history of Nile. His last published work is Haile Selassie, His Rise and Fall, which is in 2018. Aside all the academic stuff, Professor Haggai is also an athlete. He was one of the leading national high jumpers in Israel. Finally, please allow me to share a personal experience. While studying my MA in Middle Eastern Studies at Ben Gurion University in Israel, the professor of one of the courses that I was taking is called the Iranian Revolution. And my professor was an Israeli professor, and he was explaining to us how important it is for a researcher to be connected and be in a place and people that he or she is studying. Now, as you can imagine, and given the good relationship between Israel and Iran for a long time, my Israeli professor who studied about Iran for more than half of his age did not have the opportunity of going to Iran. In the discussion followed to that course in class, I shared with him about Professor Haggai Erlich and his works, which are known as by many Ethiopians, and especially history students at Addis Ababa University, at least in my time. So my teacher said to me, or the professor said to me, I envy Haggai Erlich, he said, smiling, and added, in quote, I don't think I will ever had a chance to go to Iran. At that point, I realized how privileged, those academicians who had and still have the opportunity to connect with the people they studied. So with that note, Professor Haggai, I want to express that I'm happy that you had and have the chance and have unreservedly used your privilege to share with us your research works. Professor Haggai, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mahlet. You hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Thank you very much indeed. I was privileged to be an historian of Ethiopia, and ever since 1970, I come and go and visit your wonderful country and learned from its history and try to contribute. I'm also an historian of the Middle East. So I want to give you a brief analysis of the Nile River between Egypt and Ethiopia. You know, if you go to the Bible, you see that the Nile is the river of Egypt. But if you go to the geographical and historical, more general books, it's the biggest river of Africa. So I'm going to talk briefly on the Aswan Dam in Egypt and the Renaissance Dam now being completed in Ethiopia. When the British occupied the region, not Ethiopia, but they occupied Egypt and Sudan, they sort of engineering the water system of the Nile Basin. And what they prescribed to themselves is to build a small dam in Egypt to take care of Egypt's annual needs and to erect the big dam of the Horn of Africa, of the Nile Basin in Ethiopia, in Lake Tana. They said this is the water tower of the region, and there should be erected the main dam of the old Nile system. Well, they didn't have the chance to do it in Ethiopia and Lake Tana. Emperor Menelik and then Haile Selassie would not let them enter in, thinking for some reason that once they're in, they will never leave. And what the British did is to build a small dam in Aswan. When I was a child, I learned about the Aswan Dam, which meant the small one. And Egypt at the time, I'm talking about parliamentary and monarchical Egypt up to 1952, was oriented towards Africa. In fact, what the Egyptians envisioned in their national dream was the unity of Egypt and the Sudan. They called it Wahdat Wadi Nile, the unity of the Nile Valley, because they wanted to control the sources of the Nile in Africa. But then came the 1952 revolution, which switched the Egyptians from their Egypt-oriented nationalism to an all-Arab revolution and unity. And with that, the young officer headed by Gamal Abdel Nasser, they took them 3 weeks to decide that they are going to build the all-Nile dam in Egypt itself. And as from 1959, there began the works that were completed in 1971 to build the Aswan High Dam. It was part of the vision that Egypt is part of the Arab world, less so Africa. They remain part of Africa, but were oriented on all Arab revolution, and the Aswan Dam was meant to be the hub of this all regional Arab revolution. For the inauguration of the works in Aswan Dam, they invited the president of Syria and the president of Algeria. And they simply ignored the fact, as mentioned by President Enoch, that 86% of the Nile come from Ethiopia, and the rest from Africa. The blue Nile is only, the white Nile is only 14%. But they simply ignored, and they built the wrong dam in the wrong place. Aswan Dam is in one of the hottest places in the world. Lake Nasser, which was created by the dam, loses 15% of the water by evaporation every year. And it went along with the historical concept of them that Egypt has the historical rights on the Nile. It was the first civilization they maintained, and therefore they depend on the Nile, and the Nile is their birthright. It's historical rights. And then they made an agreement with the Sudan, the brother Arab, by which all waters of the Nile are distributed among them, ignoring Ethiopia. That was the reality. In Egypt itself, by the way, until today, there is an internal discussion. Was it right to erect the dam there in Aswan, using so much water? And there were other shortcomings of the Aswan dam. In 1987, it was clear to everyone that it's very problematic, because if you have a drought in Ethiopia, you risk the drying up of the Nile in Egypt because of the dam, of the Aswan dam. So as a student of Egyptian history and of Ethiopian history, I studied the history behind the Renaissance dam, the Aswan dam, and the relation with Ethiopia. And I put it, as was said in the book, The Cross of the River, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the Nile. And there I analyzed the historical relations between Imperial Ethiopia and Egypt. And it was a story, and it is of mutual dependency. Ethiopia was dependent on Egypt to provide the Abuna, the head of the church. Egypt had always the fear that one day those Ethiopians over there will interfere with the Nile and destroy them. The story of this myth is still there, and by the way, in Egypt they return to it time and again. It's still, we have all to understand, Egypt life depends on the Nile. And as from now, they think that their destiny depends on the goodwill of others. So there is a problem. The Egyptians from their side, and I emphasize from their side, they were 100% right. They built their whole country on the Nile, and there come the Ethiopians out of nowhere for them, and they build this Renaissance dam. I want to tell you that switching side to the Ethiopians over history, as was said by Ambassador Hennock, nothing was done. Emperor Menelik promised the British that he will not interfere with the waters of the Nile without permission from His Majesty the King of Britain. Haile Selassie would not do, in fact, anything except a good bridge over the Abai, the Blue Nile. The one thing that he did was to ask for American experts to make a survey of the Blue Nile. And in 1964, they presented, or the Americans, advisors, they presented a report on where the future Ethiopian dam would be erected, not in Lake Tana, as the British envisioned, but where it is today, not far from the Sudanese border. What I can say that for centuries, the Ethiopians did very little until after 2010 or even before. I had the privilege to meet with Mahlet Zenawi, who read my book. And by the way, he recommended it to Hosni Mubarak of Egypt to read. I don't know if he did. And he was taking the American survey and studying by night. And then began the operation, the secret operation leading to February 2011 of the inauguration ceremony of the works on the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Mahlet himself died a few months later in August 2012, but Ethiopia was mobilized and until today is working successfully to build the right dam for the all Nile system in the right place. I completely share what Professor Henok, Ambassador Henok said before, that in Ethiopia itself, this major enterprise is not only a ray of hope for the economic future, but also for reuniting the country. The way I see it, there is nothing more than this great enterprise of the GERD to build on an all Ethiopian consensus. And secondly, I agree with what you said, that it is a win-win situation. It is really the right them in the right place. And the production of electricity, cheap one, is hope for the region and hope for Sudan and Egypt as well. Egypt is not going to be harmed by the GERD, only in stages that it will be filled and so on. But their anxieties are there, and I think will remain so. I'm in a profession of looking to the past and trying to understand even today's problems in their historical roots. I'm not in the profession of prophesizing, but my fellow sociologists and hydrologists, they tell me, and they can speak about the future better than me, that in 1 generation from now, there will be 500 million people in Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan. But the amount of water is not going to increase. If not the right dam in the right place, where you have little evaporation, you can produce more water in the water tower of the Ethiopian heights and electricity. You can take care of this huge population expected in the future. The thing is that in Egypt, it takes them time to adjust to the new reality. I look at that also from their point of view. It's a new world for them. For 7,000 years, Egypt had the Nile. She owned the Nile. It's the Nile of Egypt. The old culture and the economy, everything is built on that. One Egyptian told me, this is the soul of Egypt. To get accustomed to the fact that their destiny is in the hands of others, it's very difficult for them. I follow it a bit, and I see that in Egypt, slowly, it's like undergoing what the psychiatrists say, the process of mourning over a departed person. You have the stage of denial and the stage of argument and the stage of rage, and then finally acceptance. I'm not sure that the Egyptians are already there. They still claim to have historical rights, while Ethiopia raised the slogan of equitable share for all riparian countries. These are two principles that guide the international relations over rivers, and there is a conflict between them. But I keep telling my friends in both countries, thanks to the GERD, there will be waters to quarrel about, while the alternative is to suffer from thirst and die from hunger. So I'm not going to portray an overly optimistic picture. And I want to emphasize that for the Egyptians is nearly the end of the world. It's not the world that they know, that the source of the Nile are in Ethiopia. And the Ethiopians, of course, are 100% right. It is, the Blue Nile is their river. It runs 800 kilometers in Ethiopia. The World Bank, when I was writing crossing the river, I had a report from the World Bank in the year 2000, defining the Blue Nile as a prime economic resource of Ethiopia. It was wasted. It was flowing to Egypt, not only stealing waters, but stealing land. You know, in Egypt itself, you have to dig 6 to 8 meters in the valley of the Nile, in the delta, to reach soil not imported from Ethiopia, courtesy of the Blue Nile. So we have a problem, and the problem will be arguing about waters that will be available also for Egypt, and of course, mainly for the development of Ethiopia, for all the great promise of available waters and electricity. It's a revolution, first revolution in Ethiopia itself. In that sense, this resource of the Blue Nile was wasted until now. But now it's a ray of hope, as Ambassador Henok said, not only for the economy, but also for the uniting of Ethiopia again. Thank you.